When the Gestapo were searching houses for Jews, some Germans were courageous, got involved, and lied, stepped in regardless of the consequences, but others, most, didn't. The people, including the German church, hid behind legalism and religion. Well, I can't lie about hiding a Jew. God wouldn't want me to lie, and I have to follow the laws of the land, right? No, you don't. You lie, just like Sarah did, twice, like Rahab and the Israelite midwives, regardless of the risk to you personally. Lying is not always lying. Sometimes it's a strategy. It's the motive behind the lie that changes it from evil to good. The Christians in those German churches were not afraid. They were revealing the truth of what they really were, what they were all about. They placed the religious institutions above the people that were in the most vulnerable situation. Satan directed this unspeakable evil through the German churches, and they were complicit with it. Have you ever heard of Cape Coast Castle? It's one of the ports where Africans were held after being captured before they were loaded onto ships going to America to be traded as slaves. The part that I want you to be aware of is that Satan also worked through the religious leaders there as well. Right above those dungeons, where the men and women were kept in such unspeakably evil conditions, was a chapel. Yes, there were Christians gathering every Sunday for a service. They worshiped through song, listened to a sermon, and while sitting on top of the most vulnerable and broken people who were denied any shred of humanity. Look at what Satan did to Job. If it wasn't enough losing everything and then his health, Satan tried further to dehumanize him through religious people. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. I don't know how long of a period it was, but in our Bible, it's chapters 4, all the way through 37. They tear down Job by gaslighting him. They were trying to convince him that his reality with God wasn't real, that he didn't really understand who God was, and he didn't even know himself. God calls his church to be salt and light. Yet instead of ferreting out evil and fighting for people in the faith, doing what Jesus did, the Christians at those churches in Germany, the church at Cape Coast Castle, chose to cover atrocities and wrap themselves up with evil intentions instead of exposing them and defending the weakest. Is it really such a stretch to understand and accept that Satan would work through a wolf disguised as a husband to dehumanize a wife and children and to devour them? Most churches today, not all, but most, have wrapped up with the evil of covert domestic violence. They didn't help me figure it out, but told me the twisted teaching that said submission is what's best, and that I can't leave. They left me broken and vulnerable and weak, and ignored me in my dungeon. That's slavery. It's hidden slavery. I'm not contrasting pain for pain between the slavery in Guyana or the Holocaust or what happened to Job with being locked in Stockholm Syndrome to a cult of one when you're married to a wolf. What I am doing is drawing your attention to the inactivity of the shepherds in all those three examples. The church institution, the religious leaders, the ones with all the power to help, the ones with the voices, sacrificing sheep and lambs, the voiceless, powerless, for the sake of itself. Taking away someone's right to be responsible for themselves, to be self-governing, to make their own choices and to steward their own priorities, that's identity theft. If you don't have the freedom in your own marriage to say yes or no, without the fear of danger, coercion, manipulation, or fear of any kind of retribution, regardless of how you respond, that's the definition of what it means to be a slave. voiceless, helpless, and powerless. Most of the shepherds are not good like Jesus was. They set themselves up as Christian leaders, but they don't do what he did. Jesus didn't hold himself away from the muck and the mess and the ugliness that sheep and lambs find themselves in. He left heaven and entered into our mess. But most Christian shepherds refuse to do that. They won't roll up their sleeves and dive into the reality of the relationship messes. Instead, wives are told to stay married no matter what. Go home and don't make the church look bad. Broken lambs expect that the shepherd knows what's best and what's right. I expected the pastor to know that was my mistake. They tell a broken-hearted, vulnerable, and weak lamb to go home to the wolf in sheep's clothing because God hates divorce, and I believed them. God created you as a female. He created you with gifts, talents, and skills ideally suited to you as a woman. When you bury these talents instead of capitalizing and cultivating them, you're following the instruction of a blind shepherd. He wants you to bury your talent instead of multiplying it in a way that God especially created you. These are special skills and attributes found only in your femininity, created especially to expose sin and darkness in your marriage and to protect you. I'm disgusted. I know that's a pretty strong word, but that's the word that best captures how I feel when I look back over my history and I recount the theologically tethered excuses and objections as a way that shepherds are using to keep lambs, the most broken-hearted, vulnerable, and weak, invisibly shackled to the wolves that are feeding off of them. Then, when the lambs become so broken they commit suicide or end up hospitalized because their bodies are racked with inflammation and disease, or worse, murdered because they tried to leave but no one would listen or help them or even believe them, then the leadership in question feigns ignorance in order to avoid accountability for their lack of compassion, care, education, resources, and action. The reason we don't hear about abuse in marriage, teaching about warfare and wolves, is because it will divide the congregation. The same reason pastors of the Anglican Church wouldn't preach about slavery at Cape Coast Castle, because it would have offended the majority of the congregation. The same reason pastors of the churches in Germany wouldn't preach against the annihilation of the Jews. It would have diminished the congregations. The same reason they won't preach against abortion, same-sex marriage, and gender identity, or critical race theory. The majority of the congregation would leave. It will make less giving units in the pews because unbelievers will leave, including the wolves. If church leaders were to teach the truth, according to the way the apostles talked about warfare and wolves, instead of teaching partial truth, it would drive out the many of the church attendants, leaving only the few. Now, wouldn't it? Sadly, instead of protecting the sheep and the lambs, they protect the programs and the institution and the money coming into it. Programs are prioritized over people, and it's called good shepherding, when in reality, it's a 21st century repeat of the den of thieves that Jesus refers to in Matthew 21:12. He was quoting from Jeremiah 7 when he said, "My house will be called a house of prayer, but you're making it a den of thieves." Look what happened in Matthew 21:12, right after Jesus did his house cleaning. Look who was now able to enter it when it was safe. The blind, the lame, the broken. God doesn't leave us stranded when the shepherds take advantage of us and abandon us wives. Nope, he says he'll do it himself. Are we living in the fulfillment of Ezekiel 34? Maybe. All I know is that the Christian church leaders, with all the knowledge and power and the ability to help me, didn't. God did, though. He rescued me himself, and I know he will rescue you too. Stop letting blind guides teach you about yourself as a woman, because submission has nothing to do with your God-given femininity or being in relationship with a man.